Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Shuchi, and I, along with my colleague Brittany, am excited to welcome you all to the ESG Now and Beyond series, where we will delve into the dynamic landscape of environmental, social, and governance practices. Say hello, tell us where you're joining from. You know how much we love hearing from you, and chime in with your questions and comments anytime. Keep them separate so that helps us stay organized. We are delighted to have, we have Kenzie here, and I think Tom should be joining shortly, but two industry leaders with us to kick off the series. Without further ado, Kenzie, can you spend a few minutes, tell us about your journey in ESG and what led you to your current role?
Yeah, of course. So right now I'm a managing director and the head of US corporate ESG at Teneo, a global CEO advisory firm. But there's Tom.
Tom's here.
I'm gonna stop so you
Like,
can
oops, sorry.
hop on.
There.
Hi, we're so glad you made it. Um, I was just introducing myself, so I'll be a lot shorter. So yeah, I started my career in finance in New York City at Goldman Sachs. I worked in private wealth management. That's when I first heard the term ESG. Goldman had launched a research group, GS Sustain, in 2007, I believe, or 2008. So it got my attention, and I noticed that high net worth clients wanted to read the research, which also got my attention. And so then, 6 years at Goldman, I joined Teneo as the 13th employee. I did investor relations consulting, and my first ESG project was an IR survey on ESG. So I was able to, do a project and, focus on ESG, which I hadn't done in my previous job. And I loved it. And I knew I wanted to try to turn my career in that direction. And back then, it wasn't something everyone was talking about. I think most people did not know what the acronym meant. But after that, I went and started my own business, did consulting for a short while. And then after that, I joined Abernathy McGregor in 2016, built their ESG program from the ground up. It's another consulting firm. I then was recruited to go in-house by a client. So I was an SVP at Truist. And now I'm back on the consulting side. So overall, I've been in-house and on the consulting side for ESG. I have been doing it longer, not as long as Tom, but longer than most people I meet. And I still enjoy it, no matter what you read.
No, that's wonderful. I think both of you have pretty incredible and diverse career journeys. So thank you for sharing. With that, Tom, over to you. Can you tell us about your journey to your current role and what led you to it?
Completely by accident.
Yeah.
I had a friend, I was living in Spain at the time, where I grew up. And I had a friend who was a banker, lived in London, and he would come down and spend the summer in there. And he just said one summer, he said, like, oh, I'm going to enter this competition in the Financial Times. It's basically you come up with a business plan, you get in front of a panel of investors, and you get the startup capital. And, because let's put a business plan together. I was like, wow, intellectual stimulation. Didn't know what he was proposing. And that turned out to be one of the first ESG rating companies. It was called CSR back then, Corporate Social Responsibility. And so it was just like a summer job. And it turned out initially, most of the clients were Scandinavian pension funds investors. So they've driven a lot of the ESG market. And so I spoke the Scandinavian languages, and he goes, I need you on board to work rather than just, a summer project. And long story short, that company was sold on eventually to a company called DNV, Det Norske Veritas, which is a Norwegian 160-year-old certification body and maritime agency. And I spent nearly 25 years with them setting up ESG practices in Spain, because that's where I was living, then London, then Dubai, then China. And then 2010, I opened up our climate change office in San Francisco. Then one of my clients hired me. That's Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines. Right, like just after the first wave of the pandemic building up, and then another wave of pandemic happened and everyone was laid off again. But yeah, eventually I joined Sheldon last year, and it's been a great experience ever since.
Wonderful. And Brittany, do you want to quickly say hello? You will be my co-host for this conversation. Feel free to chime in.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Of course, of course. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We're so excited to have everyone here today, and especially Kenzie and Tom. Obviously, as you can tell from their introductions, they bring a wealth of experience to this conversation, and I'm so excited to get into these two topics. I'm Brittany Pettit. I'm Shuchi's co-host for the series. I'm the outbound product manager of ServiceNow's ESG management application product in our product portfolio. I'm kind of representing the product side or ServiceNow platform side of the conversation. Really just here to prompt the speakers with a couple of questions and make sure that we have a rich discussion across both halves of the conversation today.
Wonderful. Awesome. Well, let's get started, get to the meat of it. So can you, both of you, from your experience, give us a lay of the land? I mean, ESG, some people understand it, at least the practitioners. It's still evolving constantly on a daily basis. Where did that term come from? Can you demystify it for us? How did it all come together? Where are we? Where did we start? And how far do we have to go still? Kenzie, maybe with you?
I was going to say Tom's got to jump
Okay. You want me to start there?
Yes, go ahead.
I'll go with the kind of one of the questions. I mean, there's a few kind of questions peppered in there, but where did it come from? If it's you talking about like the investor side of it, you can go back to the early 70s. If you could talk about the corporate social responsibility or the in-house part or that premise, I guess also, I think it was 1970, there was enough discussion about that Milton Friedman came out with that phrase, the only social responsibility of a business is to maximize shareholder value. He said it better. And he actually retracted that later on, but that kind of gives you an indication of perhaps where it came from. Some of the first ESG investment firms were like values driven, so they may have been doing it for ethical principles. So they could have been pension funds, even church endowments, and so on. So there's certain, like, we'll stop investing in certain things like weapons. For example, the first fund that I know was the Pax World Fund, Pax for Peace, and I think that was a church endowment fund, and that was following the Vietnam War. They didn't want to invest in the military industrial complex. So that was the avoidance part. And then it trickled and hardly grew. And then 1990s, consumers started becoming aware of the environment. And that kind of created a bit of like reaction from companies and saying like, hey, we've got to show that we care about the environment too. And it's been a hodgepodge of things ever since then, in which nowadays we're trying to really institutionalize ESG and avoid all these kind of disparate activities and give the market basically comparable information in a nutshell.
And I'll hop in on the acronym, which is so popular right now. Not necessarily. I think the acronym was from this paper called "Who Cares Wins" in the early 2000s. That was the UN and some bankers, and at least to my knowledge, I'm sure there's many different stories about where the acronym came from, but yeah.
And then how does, I know it's the non-financial metrics. Kenzie, last time we spoke, you mentioned how it ties into the financial kind of, can you talk a little bit about why it's important and why should companies pay attention to it?
Yeah, so ultimately, because I started my career in finance and did investor relations for a while before moving to ESG consulting, I do tend to look at ESG from an investor's perspective and look at the business case for ESG. Of course, there is a case for stakeholders, and how companies impact them. But, to me, it's just very straightforward. In my view, we have, the bucket of ESG, we have environmental social governance, and it's a framework that organizes topics underneath it, just a structure. So, for the E, it could be emissions. It's non-financial data, but it's quantitative in that case. Sometimes they're qualitative, or waste. And then for social, it could be, percent women on your board. It could be, number of safety incidents, which anything related to, humans' health and well-being. And the third one, the G for governance, that is just how the company is run and includes, how the board committees are set up, how oversight is structured. I mean, we could go on and on, what's involved with governance. But to me, it's really just asking companies to disclose the non-financial information, just like they disclose financial information, and then let the market decide. It's not about, I think it's really common that people think it's about political parties or about, values and what people think is right or wrong. To me, it's just about the numbers. And, there's more to it, of course. Obviously, I care about it because I wouldn't be, in this job otherwise. But I feel like it's gotten, just blown out of proportion, and it really is pretty straightforward.
Awesome. Tom, anything to add there?
No, it's totally to back Andy up. It's to me, I feel I'm doing good when I get businesses to take it seriously. So having that governance part, being able to say, hey, this is how you integrate it into your governance framework, into your risk management, into your internal controls, that gives me a lot of satisfaction because I know it gets traction then. If it's about the narrative and the qualitative and the feel-good factor alone, it'll be subject to next budget cut. So if you integrate and you consider it's like, hey, ESG has a number of risks underneath it. It's an extension of enterprise risk management, and you should take these seriously. And there are correlating, overlapping risks and opportunities. I definitely, that's what gives me a warm, fuzzy feeling. I know it's boring, but looking at a materiality matrix, so happy.
Absolutely. And as you're talking with your portfolio of customers, I know you work across a portfolio. What are you hearing? Like, how are these conversations being received? Is there resistance? Are people open to learning and making the investment at the end of the day, if you will?
Is that for Tom or me?
For both of you, but Kenzie, how about you? Oh, we have you start.
So I think it's mixed. It's a mixed bag. We have, large public companies that have removed the acronym, from their materials. And we have other companies that are just, plowing forward. And I do find, at least in my experience, that a lot of it, I think, stems from the CEO and the board. And if they care about these issues, of course, there's more to it than that, because there are, business impacts, financial impacts. But I have found that kind of tends to be the case, not always. But, we have found that a lot of the companies that have dropped the term have been mostly in, Northeast and, Southeast, drop the term, Northeast, keep the term, West Coast, keep the term, Midwest, drop the term. And it depends, right? It depends on if a company has a lot of customers in the Southeast, where I'm from, or if a company has a lot of, employees in another region. But I think at the end of the day, it's just a word. And I'm going to quote Shakespeare, a rose is a rose by any other name. So it doesn't matter what we call it. It's about what's underneath it and the topics.
Tom?
Yeah, thankfully, it's like I've gone beyond the early days of my career where I had to actually persuade anyone to do it. They know they have to. Most of the clients I'm facing nowadays know they have to do something, are embracing it. They see it's added value. It's sometimes just navigating all these different expectations, because one client of theirs may say, hey, we want to see you get an environmental management system certification across your operations, for example. And then another client comes say, we want you to set science-based targets. And sometimes I see companies kind of getting the first request there and thinking, hey, okay, we'll solve it with that. I say, no, you really do want to know what's coming over the horizon. What's the next expectation that's going to happen? Don't be caught on the back foot by, and all of a sudden, one of your biggest clients want to have a measurable climate reduction target and want you to commit to, the TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So it can get very specific and granular, and sometimes companies can go, yes, we'll get that, we'll do that, and then they, next month or next quarter, they get a different request of new regulation, and they haven't really seen what's coming and prepared for that. So someone's just now getting like, what exactly should they do now to perhaps understandably respond to a client, but what can they do at the same time to prepare?
Wonderful.
I'm going to add on to that, if that's okay. I just was going to mention that, I think the hard part about ESG is that it really truly changes every day, because in the grand scheme of things, it's pretty nascent compared to, other industry or practice areas. And, there's, just, yesterday we found out about the SEC and the climate ruling. And I love that the book is still being written for ESG. I love that side of it. I will say lately, so much has happened that it's hard to stay on top of everything, and there's so much content out there that it's just, you got to, if you're in this job, you have to stay abreast of all the information.
Absolutely. And Brittany, do you have anything to add or there?
Yeah, I'm really curious about this. Like, I think, Tom, you brought up a good point around having to not necessarily convince anyone to do sustainability or ESG anymore. And I'm curious, like, when did that shift happen? What was sort of the prompt, at the point at which we got to where sustainability professionals, folks in ESG or CSR, depending on when the shift happened, at what point did we get to be able to say, okay, yes, everybody's on the same page. We have to do this because it makes business sense. Like, when did that happen? And what are sort of those common business impacts that, regardless of how the acronym changes or the name of this happens, what are those foundational business impacts that running a sustainable organization we have decided are always true, and that the corporate world has accepted those things? Like, when did that transition occur?
It depends. If you can follow up that with when and where, that could be a different answer. So my first part of my career was in Europe. And I think we all acknowledge that Europe was further ahead when it comes to ESG than the US was, especially when I moved from Europe to the States, which was 2010. But even in Europe, it would have happened probably, I would have said, yeah, mid 2000s would have been when European companies just said, like, they all have to do it. You had the Grenelle law in France, which mandated reporting. The first ESG regulations I came across was the Norway Companies Act, which said you had to report. You had to report if you had any environmental or social impacts. It was about that. That was a line. But all these laws, which were initially poorly designed, sometimes, they built up in Europe. And Norway was also the first country to mandate 40% female representation on all boards of directors in listed companies. So that was a challenge, and they became aware of that. So yeah, Europe 2005, the US, I'd say in the last 4-5 years. The rise, if you look at the kind of percentage of global assets under management in ESG, it really took off like, what would say 2019, I'd say. It really kind of launched off this. If you look at like principles for responsible investment as a metric of how many investors are out there and signatories there are, that's showed the same kind of escalation at that time.
Kenzie, do you have a thought or a comment?
I do, of course. No, I agree with him, absolutely. And I think, just in my view, another factor was in the US, the Business Roundtable's statement on the purpose of a corporation. where all these big companies and their CEOs, acknowledge that it's not just about, shareholders and Milton Friedman and whatnot, but, there's a place for both. So I think that's what's important. But to me, that was a big shift, followed by the pandemic. So Tom said, past 4 years, dead on the 2020, when the pandemic hit. I think it was a big focus on how are you physically protecting your workers? Like, are you giving them masks? Are you giving them hand sanitizer? Like for a manufacturing facility, for example. Are you giving them the tools they need at home? Are you investing in the technology they need to continue to do their job? And it was just, companies really thinking about the health of their employees in a way that impacted everyone. So I think that was a big factor. And then the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, was also an important factor. And so these things, all of these things relate to ESG. And I think it just became more of a household term. So, but now we see the shift away from the term in some cases, but.
A follow-up question to that. I mean, there are companies that have operations across the globe, right? It's not just US-centric or European-centric. What are some of the best practices and what are people doing when it comes to keeping up with kind of global regulation, some parts where it's mandatory, others it's voluntary? Like how are companies keeping up with everything? Tom?
With regulations. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it's crazy, and trying to keep on top of them. Like yesterday, the SEC came out, and I spent 2.5 hours listening to that webcast. The EU CSRDD didn't pass. That I think someone entered what country vetoed it. So that's come off the table now, but there's something else will pop up. I think what the one thing that companies can do to try to kind of prepare for any relevant region or country that they're going to operate in and their ESG requirements is to look at what the common frameworks are. And because we've had this hodgepodge, fragmented framework world of ESG, it's been tough for companies to prepare for that now. But ultimately, I think with last year's launch of ISSB's 2 sustainability standards, or sustainability and climate standards, they are the cornerstone of most regulations because they integrated TCFD, which I mentioned before, into that. It also integrated and cooperates with science-based target setting. So it's kind of like become a black hole gravity pull of standards and consolidation. If you look at that and you look at how that's been adopted in regulations, then they'll at least give you kind of a common starting point. I think it was mentioned at the SEC webcast yesterday. They basically call that TCFD as being the ultimate framework that the law was inspired by, or the rule was inspired by, but they also recognize that ISSB, even though it's not even mentioned or referenced anywhere, is the body that's kind of assumed the framework. So I would say, take a look at ISSB, take a look at whatever markets you're facing, whether you're operating or you're listed somewhere, take a look at that and see how it can be applied.
Okay. Kenzie, anything to add there?
Yeah, I would just say, I think one of the most important things is, putting internal controls and, audit functions and whatnot around non-financial data as well as financial data. Again, to me, it's just straightforward, making sure, like, for example, human capital management metrics have the same, scrutiny or rigidity around their accuracy, their validity, all the things. And just, to me, it's just really having that mindset of the shift that data and metrics are just data and metrics, and we have to just account for all of them. The more transparency a company gives to investors, they love that. They want to know as much as possible, right? And employees and other stakeholders.
Okay, wonderful. Well, there's a couple of questions. If we're okay, I'd love to kind of take them as we go along. So the first one's from Mary. regarding business impact of ESG, what are you seeing from companies using it for to attract employees and to retain them? Anything comes to mind, Kenzie?
I don't want, okay, I don't want to talk too much. So I guess, we see a lot of it. I mean, we have found, of course, not everybody and, younger generations, not every, Gen Z person thinks that this is important, but a lot of them do. You see them going to thrift stores more and more, that idea of circularity. So, study after study shows that companies at the end of, or people at the end of the day, employees want to be at companies that have a similar outlook on life. It doesn't have to be exact, but you'll see things that you can relate to. It's like, oh, this company has great maternity leave. You get 6 months. Oh, this company has a gym. You get a free gym membership. It's things that in turn actually help the company. So I think that, again, it's good for both the individual and it's good for not only recruiting but retaining.
Yep.
I kind of back to saying this, like, so attraction retention is one of those things that's very hard to kind of like measure the direct impact of a company's ESG program on that. A company will track turnover, churn, and be able to see that and can see whether it changes, but not entirely be sure about what causes it. But, truth is, a lot of companies have employee resource groups nowadays that engage, as Ken says, people with like minds.
Mm-hmm.
And the workplace is a highly social place. And, we don't just want to work with our colleagues, we want to socialize with them and get to know them. So it's I think the attraction or the retention part, yes, you can, definitely see the initiatives that, make the company an attractive place to work. And that works, and we can track it through employee surveys as well. But, it's not necessarily exclusively ESG measured, the Great Place to Work survey, for example, which Sheldon scores very high on, by the way.
I know, ServiceNow does too. So
yeah. But yes, no, we that's is literally what clinched the deal for me with Shellman. Was that Avni Desai, our CEO, is
I love her.
color and heads up one of the top 50 CPA firms. Yep. And that's reflected in our culture, our ERG, our employee resource groups, very diverse, and we're a nearly 100% remote company in one sense. So it really is important to engage. I think I got a session this afternoon.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to ask one quick question and then maybe hand it over to Brittany for the second part of our conversation. So we talked about perhaps the what and the landscape, and now we'll move to the why. But could you address the anti-ESG sentiment and say something about, like, how do we weave a positive narrative into the storytelling, if you will?
I can kick this one off. I tell you what, initially when I started hearing about the anti-ESG sentiment and state laws that started to, or proposals that started to come up, I kind of dismissed it, going like, been through it before. Corporate social responsibility dropped the S at some point in the 90s. It became corporate responsibility, because the S was seen as a little bit too kind of, fluffy. So there's a little bit of backlash. And we had sustainability as well in ESG, there's all different ways of doing it. But I am seeing the impact, not a wave or anything, nothing dramatic, but I'm hearing anecdotally about the impacts that those laws are having. Give an example, Texas basically put in place a law that I'm not sure exactly how it's worded, which usually seems really weird with these laws, but basically any kind of Barclays, I think it was Barclays investors, was excluded from a state contract because they had a science-based target. I think that's what it boiled down to. Then I haven't looked into too much detail, but I've seen how that has impacted other investors trying to do business in Texas, where they are, we've heard the term greenhushing, essentially. So yes, I am anecdotally seeing the impacts. At the end of the day, my perspective is ESG grew as a voluntary thing. There were some regulations, but largely it was voluntary growth. That means the free market worked, and it responded to society's shifting expectations and what we consider fair and just in this world. So just accept it. I think putting together ESG laws in states is probably the most anti-capitalistic thing you could do.
Yeah. Great. Kenzie, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just add, I really do think so much of it comes from a lack of understanding. At Teneo, where I work, we do materiality assessments for clients, and as part of the materiality assessment, you do interviews with various stakeholders, including the board and leadership team. And I will say that I have been surprised how many very senior executives I've come across don't really know what ESG is. I met a board member that said it was just DEI. I met another executive that thought it stood for emissions, social, and governance, and happened to be in Texas. Yeah, I just think that I wish there were more education. I wish it was, better understood, because I think there's a lot of misinformation. Only other thing I would say is, we are in an election year, and I think that as these things go, we, see a emphasis on certain topic areas and, get momentum. So I personally think some of it will die down, not all of it, but I think it's a fever pitch right now, given the election year and heading into November. The last thing I'll say is my colleagues at Teneo, Matt and Diana and Navi, they have been tracking the use of the term ESG in sustainability reports and on earnings calls. And we've been pleasantly surprised that actually at this point so far, with the companies that have reported earnings, and reported more so on the sustainability report, for those companies that have already issued their 2023 sustainability report about last year's data, the number of times the term ESG is used in the title and in the report has actually gone up since last year.
That's great.
I think it'll be interesting, if I may say so, to also do job postings.
That's a great point.
I've seen definitely a little bit of a drop or reduction in ESG as a job.
Interesting data point.
Well, that's just me. It's like,
Yeah, but then I same, and I think they just call it different things. I mean, we're still super busy. I was up very late working, and so I think, again, with just misinformation, misunderstanding, I don't think it's going away by any means. But yeah, it's a great point on the jobs.
It's less about the word or the term, because I don't think ESG resonates with anyone outside of business or investor context.
Yeah.
I prefer sustainability.
Yeah.
That's just my preference. And I actually resisted that initially after corporate responsibility, but okay, sustainability can work. But it is the perception that is an environmental sustainability, and I do not agree. And I know Kenzie doesn't agree with
I know,
right?
No, it's so true. It drives me crazy.
Yeah, it's like the term sustainability comes, let's say, from the UN framework for sustainable development, 1987, and it's applied to all of it, and that begat the UN Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah.
So it is all about everything that ESG is. It's just a different term. And kind of conclude back on the previous question, yes, it's unfortunate it's happening now, but it is a knee-jerk reaction, exactly as Kenzie says, by people who are not terribly informed about what ESG is. It should be embraced by people who are traditionally capitalist or have that free market mindset. I totally think that. But it's just come wrapped up in the whole sort of like culture wars and because it seems woke. I think that's essentially that's unfortunately that's what's happening.
Mhm. Well, that's exactly why we started the series. Hopefully, it'll help move the needle in a positive direction from an education perspective. But with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Brittany for the second half. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, and I think that sets us up really nicely for the second half of this conversation. So to Shuchi's point, we really spent the first half kind of talking about ESG sustainability as a domain or as a practice area, kind of what's the state of the state. And I think a lot of, and even the questions that I see in the Q&A are about what that means from an internal standpoint. So within an organization, what does this actually look like? And I think to Tom's point, that's a lot of internal practice is under the heading of sustainability, right? You have a chief sustainability officer as opposed to a chief ESG officer, right? It's very subjective as to whether ESG and sustainability are interchangeable. I think according to SASB, they're still synonymous with one another, but regardless or irregardless, as they say in Mean Girls World, there are a couple of sort of ways that we're starting to see these changes that we talked about in the ESG world start to manifest within sustainability organizations in-house within an organization. So I really just want to focus the conversation on how everything that we just discussed is manifesting within an internal sustainability team through the lens of the CSO and the teams that report to them. So kind of starting off the conversation, or this half of the conversation, I should say, I guess I'll start with Kenzie. Could you tell us a little bit about how you see the sustainability practice and the set of personas, the folks that you talk to within an organization, how you see that changing over time, or how you've seen that change in the last year or so as ESG has both gotten a lot of momentum and started to get some pushback? What does that mean both to the CSO as a persona and to the teams that support them?
Yeah, these are great questions, and something we do at Teneo as well is just help set up, oversight, ESG councils, structures like that. So very familiar with the question. So I think it really depends. A lot of it depends on who the CSO reports to. Do they report up through finance? Do they report, to the CFO? Do they report up through legal? Do they report up through, in some cases, marketing and communications, which I don't advise, but that's another topic. So I really think that it stems from that oversight. Like the governance is always, at the top, and it should be GES, or because I feel like you have to start with good governance. But so based on that, when I was in-house, we did report to, we were in the chairman's office. And so we were working with the most senior leaders at the firm. And I think in most cases, a lot of companies do not have enough ESG resources. They haven't budgeted for it in the past. And so I think in many cases, you're seeing it start with just a head of ESG or an ESG analyst. And then as these reporting requirements and regulation come about, they're realizing they need more resources. And that's where, one of the things we talked about earlier, the internal controls, the audit function, like making sure that ESG is a part of that. So, some companies will add ESG, onto someone that's already doing, internal audit around, financial elements. But I think it really depends on the company. I think, though, what's most important, again, is just making sure the board has knowledge about what's going on with ESG, its opportunities, its risks, and then having a good, structure reporting down. The last thing I'll say is it is very common now to have some sort of, cross-functional ESG council or ESG committee, with people from HR, with people from investor relations, with people from communications, you get it. So, and that kind of brings us back to, it's one of the things I love about ESG is you interact with all those areas because it's relevant to all of them. But yeah, so many changes going on in the in-house structure.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Tom, go ahead. And I think Kenzie did a great point of kind of teeing up Tim's question on governance. Could you incorporate that into your answer as well? Like how you see the sustainability function within an organization changing, and maybe what role does governance play in some of these transitions, or how are you seeing that appear? What's the sort of plus one or value add of incorporating that governance model into in-house sustainability teams?
I mean, of course, everything I can start off with, it depends. And, my experience is with very large companies. So it's what I'm about to say is like that's great and affordable for a large brand. But I think in that situation, a chief sustainability officer is a networker, liaiser with existing functions of the organization, just to kind of finalize that, talk about the role of the CSO and a sustainability or ESG team. But there shouldn't be a replication of the duties of these separate functions out there. Place, or if you can, hire an ESG professional within each kind of department. Happening when I was working in Royal Caribbean. So the procurement department, they hired an ESG person. Ships in operation hired, they had multiple people already working on that because for so long they've been working. So, devolve that ownership and keep that ownership with the functions. The ESG team and the CSO are there to coordinate, liaise, be ambassadors, collect information, and work on that governance side together with, because they're higher up there, the CSO should be report to the CEO and, work on that part and the strategic side of the ESG or sustainability. Within the governance part, yes, work with legal counsel to ensure that committee charters, address what's relevant to the ESG market, so that, if you can afford, if you have a big enough structure, you can again have a separate committee that looks at sustainability, or if not that, put it in the internal audit committee. Or I've seen it in governance nomination committees, all across different permutations of that. But yes, drive ownership there. Make sure that not necessarily they have like full ESG training, but they are aware of the objectives of the company and can hold the company accountable to that. Then you have to work with strategy teams to look at the impact of that. And sometimes it's quite imaginative. I'm sure Kenzie has seen this. Seen like, yes, they'll even get like an external stakeholder panel of the great and the wise of sustainability to kind of look at them from the outside entirely. They're not even directors of the company. When I worked with Lockheed Martin, they had a sustainability stakeholder council that advised
Novartis does as well. I've seen them in pharma. Yeah.
Yeah, Novartis is a great company from a pharma.
I know, it's so great, right?
Yeah, Swiss. But yeah, look at all the different models. What's relevant to you? Because all these things I'm describing are like big companies, great sounding things. At Royal Caribbean, they brought in World Wildlife Fund to be a partner and hold the cruise company accountable to every single commitment they made. And I was lucky enough and challenged by being the main liaison between WWF and Royal Caribbean, and it was, they did not let go. For each target, they had a separate person, WWF, that liaised with all the separate functions within Royal Caribbean. It was great relationship building. It was great accountability. It was challenging. But yeah, that's what suited that kind of company. And like I said, that kind of external non-for oversight is sometimes good as well.
I think it was really interesting. Yeah, it definitely does. And I think what's really interesting about what you both said is there is such a strong reliance on relationship building. Like you said, Tom, there just is so much sort of cross-functional work and team development. A lot of the work of sustainability doesn't happen within the Office of Sustainability, right? It happens, like you said, kind of in these other groups, in these other business functions. And it's really just the sustainability team and the CSO that's pulling everybody together to work toward a common goal.
Yeah.
I'm curious if that makes it any harder for the CSO to accomplish or to push for certain objectives like driving impact in the organization, or if it means that they have to really focus more on the compliance side of things. Like, do they have to take a step back and say, okay, take kind of like the stick approach, right? We need everybody to work together in order to be compliant to these regulations, or from a governance standpoint to satisfy investor demands and transparency that stakeholders are asking for? Or does that give them a green light and the opportunity to push the gas pedal once you have all these folks in the room and say, okay, we're going to attain this really aspirational goal. We're really going to focus on driving impact and outcomes. Like, at what point does that team building help you to push the narrative forward, drive those outcomes and those impacts? Or does it sort of signal a shift towards being a little bit more reactionary and more compliance oriented? Maybe Kenzie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, of course. So these are all great questions. I think that Pia Heidemark Cook, she was the CSO at IKEA for a long time, and she's a senior advisor at Teneo. I think she said this line that is one of my favorites. She said that if you're not pushing aggressively, you're not doing your job. And it's just so true that so much of your role is being uncomfortable. People aren't going to like what you have to say a lot of the time, but you still have to push, right? And I think that's a huge part of it, in terms of driving impact. The other thing I was going to say was, with organizations like having an ESG council or an ESG committee that's cross-functional, oftentimes when companies set long-term targets, they're, or at least this is becoming more common, and I think companies should do this, assigning like ownership of moving forward on that work to a person. So, so it's on someone's shoulders, and, just to continue to make sure that the machine's still running, everything's still going, and you're, getting closer to those targets and commitments. The last thing I would say is driving progress. I think definitely at the senior leadership level would be including ESG in executive compensation. So including ESG metrics in executive compensation. For someone that may not know much about that, it's when, companies decide, okay, the leadership team, we're going to look at how much they get paid, or they're, through the lens of, did they accomplish these things? So some have scorecards. Others, it's like, I see a lot in manufacturing companies, oil and gas, it's things like number of safety incidents. It's like making sure that they're being motivated to drive good ESG outcomes.
Awesome. Tom, anything else to add?
No. Something is like when you talk, and Mackenzie's right, you have to be a little bit of a fighter, or you have to be very certain in your convictions. But I believe the most effective CSO will use those convictions to persuade the ESG committees, the CEO, and then, exactly as Kenzie says, then that should then manifest itself in compensation linked to ESG, accountability linked to ESG, and performance reviews linked to ESG, and it should then cascade down through that the organization chart. No order should come in isolation from a CSO to the head of a function internally. They're more of like a persuader and diplomat in a way, but they're whispering to the CEO, they're whispering to the committee, and they're very effective in persuading at that level.
I love that.
Those are great points.
Yeah, agreed. Really, really taking on the role of like the chief persuader officer to take lead on some of these.
Chief influence officer.
I had a thought before, Kenzie. You just mentioned about the G should be good before the S and the E. Do you think we just like rebrand it? Like all these laws will be moot? No, we don't have an ESG program.
Right. I mean, it should start with governance. 100%. I say that. We do ESG reports for clients, and I always say, okay, the governance and oversight section has to be very close to the introduction and CEO letter, right?
Totally makes sense. All right, I want to make sure that we have time to get through the audience Q&As, and thank you all for the questions that you've submitted, and please keep them coming in these last 10 minutes or so. While we're sort of talking about the function of the CSO and the role of the sustainability team, there's a question around somebody who's kind of looking to move into this particular field. Do you have any career advice for somebody who wants to enter the field but doesn't have experience? What learnings, credentials, or experience would be required to be an ideal candidate? And I will ask that we kind of start from the perspective of a sustainability function within an organization, like a sustainability practitioner, but also acknowledge that there are a lot of ways to do sustainability work that don't necessarily require having a CSO title or being a sustainability analyst within an organization. So I guess maybe starting with Tom, based on your background of sort of accidentally winding up in the sustainability function, how would somebody go about that more intentionally today? What would that path, what could that look like for somebody that wants to get into this field?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, initially it was, you had to just become like a thematic, holistic, and be knowledgeable at a kind of top level, but never really know how challenging it is as someone starting off in business to work throughout the organization, perhaps, and in the business process of it. So I would advise anyone to follow their commitments, the area, the theme that they're passionate about, focus on that, and then build it up, but also get good business grounding. Understand that you will have a bigger impact in this world if you can, impregnate corporations with ESG DNA. And it's not going to happen just because you're like, yay, we've got to do the right thing. No, you have to kind of be a bit realist. You have to understand how that's going to be implemented in the organization.
Sense. Kenzie?
Yeah, those are all excellent points. I think for me, one of the big things is just educating yourself. There are so many things out there now. I think back when I was first interested, there weren't as many, in like 2011 and 12, when I did that first project. But there are great certifications out there. I have my SASB has the FSA levels 1 and 2. I'm certified. Yes, it was hard, but it was worth it. And it really, I come back to so many things I learned doing that again and again. I think the other thing is colleges, universities, you are starting to see master's programs with a focus on this. So clearly it depends on where you are in your career, but there's more out there. And I think, again, just reading, I mean, for me, I wake up dying to read what's happening about this, so it doesn't feel like work. So I think, that is important too, to have passion. Like, I think this is a job where you have to care, to keep pushing.
I love that. Yes, and I think that's probably true for everybody on this phone, or everybody on this call. As you wake up, look at your phone. What is the latest? What happened? What's everyone saying about the SEC rule? What does this look like? What does this mean for me? Totally agreed. I think that passion, I agree, grounds everything. This is a little bit more of a, I guess, a tactical question in terms of how you implement sustainability, kind of marrying the theme of ESG, the trending theme, with another trending theme of AI. So this question asks, in what ways is or can AI support ESG? Are there any organizations that are leading or on the forefront in leveraging AI to make a positive, scalable impact for their ESG? Either one of you have experience with this? Have you seen this? Know good examples?
So I was doing a review of ESG ratings companies the other week, and I was looking at how they come up with a rating for a company. And back in my day, it was the Economist called this in one article, the teenage scribblers of the financial world. I love that quote. And it's like, we were all doing manually. Then you started getting up with these web spiders that will go out and harvest information. And I was surprised, out of the top 10 ESG ratings firms, only 1 or 2 actually had AI. So I haven't really used it in the application of ESG. I'm sure it's got huge potential. I'm excited to do that. Just as I think blockchain has great potential and Internet of Things, all these other challenges. But also, let's not forget AI, huge consumer of energy. It's like there's an article the other day about how the growth of AI is really going to be pushing the data center industry to be one of the highest emitters in the globe. So let's look at both sides. AI also has huge ethical issues around decision making, and how do we even audit kind of AI to see that it's not making unethical decisions. And we've seen that happen all the time. Google's AI was like, I think it was accused of being over woke or something like that. The other day. But yes, it's early technologies. We got to look at the good and we got to look at the bad.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much we could talk about on this one. I think what is important is, not only look at opportunities to use AI in ESG, practice areas and projects, but, really also thinking about the impacts, right? So I believe the first regulation came out in Europe last summer, or just, was released. I think it's like the AI Act, or I can't remember the name of it, but and that there are several meetings going on in the White House and elsewhere around how to put parameters around AI. My hope is that it can also be used eventually to help someone like me keep track of all the news. I love reading and what's happening, excuse me, but there's just not enough time in the day. And so I would love for there to be a program that tells me everything I need to know. Yeah, I think the other side that we just have to be mindful of is that, AI does also, in many cases, replace people's jobs. And so making sure companies are being mindful of the social impacts of AI.
Both really good points. And just the quickest, smallest of plugs, I would also suggest that for folks on the phone who happen to be customers of ServiceNow's on the platform, I would definitely recommend that you reach out to your account team, your leader, and this is probably true for any major technologies or enterprise platforms that you're on, to understand what they're doing around AI, both to understand how the governance of AI on their platforms is going to impact you, but also to ask how you can leverage those sets of tools to support your business efforts around ESG. I know that our folks our account managers are always happy to connect you with the folks internally to do that. And very, agnostically, I would say reach out to any of the enterprise platforms that you run on in your organization to start asking some of these questions. Okay, we have 2 minutes. Kimberly asked a great question around nonprofits. And she also asked another really good question around what your favorite conference or your recommended conference would be to go to in the US to learn more about ESG. So I will ask each of you to choose one of those 2 questions to give us a quick final answer on. I guess, Kenzie, is there a final conference or a favorite conference of yours that you would go to, and maybe blend the 2 questions together, specifically where you could learn a little bit more about the function of ESG in nonprofits?
Yeah, I mean, for nonprofits specifically, that is not a big focus of my job. We of course, collect data about grants and whatnot, but I mean, I think that conferences like Moral Money, I mean, that one, they're more business oriented, but you're just going to learn so much. And there are a lot of media outlets that, have ESG conferences, and, banks also hold them. I have to give a shout out to Goldman. Their Sustainability Summit, I think, is one of the best. They have it every year. So, I'd have to do some digging on specific ones for nonprofits, but yeah.
Super helpful. Thank you. Tom?
I also have to caveat, I have very little experience about ESG and nonprofits. So I'm going to focus and cheat out of this and just mention and give a plug to some good friends of mine at GreenBiz.
Oh, yes.
And Joe McCarran and team. My office was in Oakland and was just around the corner from theirs. And I was in the executive network, but yes, absolutely wonderful conferences. I would definitely say it's not the cheapest one. But yeah, also Sustainable Brands was quite good. I always used to enjoy going to that in San Diego, but
that's
Green
good too.
for sure.
Yeah.
Awesome. That's
I
great.
wanted to,
Yeah, go ahead, Kenzie.
sorry, there was one thing I wanted to say, and then I promise that's it. It was just, you know, we were talking earlier, Tom, about it's hard to measure culture and human capital, and it is, but I think that it's so important to focus on that. And there are ways that, you know, companies haven't necessarily historically collected this data, but, you know, not only, as he said, with things like turnover rates, also promotion rates, scores on engagement surveys that employees do, participation in those, litigation from, let's say, for example, sexual harassment, or the fines and fees from litigation around sexual harassment incidents. It's also things like how many, you know, for manufacturing company, total reportable incident rate. For some, unfortunately, it's fatalities, but it's just, again, about looking for that information and making it a part of your, you know, financial data center, and just, you know, treating all financial data like the financial data.
It's a really good point. And I think underpinning all of this is the point that data is king, whether you are talking about internally managing your impact, understanding what your data governance looks like for your external disclosures, and really just starting to appreciate the value that AI can bring as you're starting to digest some of that data. I think that's a really good point as well, and probably a big evolution as we start to look forward at what's next for ESG as well. Well, we are at the top of the hour, so I want to say thank you so much to both of you. Your insights, your experience, the value that you bring to the conversation is second to none. I'm so grateful to have the two of you in a room. Thank you so much for sharing today, and thank you to the audience, to the folks that asked all of your great questions. We really appreciate it, and for folks that are joining us on the recording, thank you so much for taking the time. We appreciate it. And we will see you on the next ESG Now and Beyond series.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. We appreciate it.
Of course.